The encounter on the road. The bitter winter evening stretched endlessly across an open expanse of farmland, each flake of snow swirling down from a steel-gray sky, covering everything in a white blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. Orson's truck, a massive refrigerated behemoth carrying produce and a last-minute shipment of delicate wedding flowers, sliced through the desolate landscape like a knife, its headlights illuminating only a few feet of road ahead. Inside, the dashboard displayed a temperature far below freezing, and Orson shivered as he cranked up the heater a notch. He'd been driving for hours, his eyes heavy from the monotony of the white scenery flashing by. The truck's engine hummed steadily, a comforting white noise that filled the cab. His mind, however, wasn't on the road. It drifted to the demands of his boss and the sacrifices he'd made to keep this job. A job that, he reflected bitterly, had cost him more than he cared to admit. The sudden vibration of his phone snapped him out of his thoughts. Seeing his boss's name flash across the screen, he felt a pang of dread. Calls from the boss rarely meant anything good, especially this late in the evening. "Orson, I don't care what it takes. You have to make that delivery on time." The voice on the other end was sharp and impatient, each word cutting through Orson's fatigue like shards of glass. "Those flowers can't be late. I don't care if you have to drive through a blizzard. Just get it done." "Yes, sir," Orson replied, his voice flat and resigned. He hung up with a sigh, his grip tightening on the wheel. Years of accumulated frustration bubbled to the surface, and he found himself muttering to the empty cab, letting his grievances spill out to the hum of the engine. 15 years. 15 years of being at their beck and call. What's left? Just me, this truck, and an empty apartment. Lost in his thoughts, he almost didn't notice the splash of pink that flashed in his peripheral vision, stark against the endless white. He blinked, leaning forward to peer through the thickening snowfall, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. Was it a trick of the light, or was there really someone out there, standing by the side of the road in this freezing weather? As he drew closer, the pink shape began to take form, resolving itself into the figure of a young girl. She couldn't have been more than 13, and she was wearing nothing but a thin pink dress that barely reached her knees. Her arms were wrapped around herself as she shivered violently, her entire body trembling from the bitter cold. Orson's foot hovered over the brake pedal, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. He knew he was already running late, that his boss would have his head if he delayed further. And yet, the image of the girl standing alone in the snow, her skin blue with cold, tugged at something deep within him. He thought of the dangers, his mind conjuring up every horror story he'd ever heard about highway traps and roadside scams. She could be bait, he reasoned, part of some twisted setup. But even as he tried to rationalize his decision to drive on, a voice in the back of his mind whispered that this was different, that this was real. Swallowing his doubts, he pressed down on the accelerator, leaving her behind. He tried to tell himself he had no choice, that his job was on the line, that someone else would stop for her. But as the miles stretched on, the guilt gnawed at him, an ever-growing weight that refused to be shaken. He finally reached the gas station, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow against the snow. Going through the motions of filling the tank, he felt hollow, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like the snow-filled clouds overhead. Inside, he overheard two men discussing a girl in a pink dress, and his stomach twisted. They had seen her too, and like him, they had driven past without stopping. Their callous laughter echoed in his ears as he returned to his truck. He couldn't bear the thought of being like them, indifferent, uncaring. He knew he had to go back. The consequences no longer mattered. He couldn't live with himself if he left her out there alone. He turned the truck around, retracing his route through the storm. The snow fell thicker now, reducing visibility, but he pushed forward, scanning the roadside for any sign of pink. After what felt like an eternity, he spotted her again, standing exactly where he had left her, like a haunting specter in the endless white. He pulled over, jumped out of the truck, and hurried to her side. Up close, he could see the severity of her condition. Her skin had taken on a dangerous, bluish tint, and her shivers were so violent she could barely stand. Without a word, he removed his own jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders, the warmth of the fabric seeming to revive her slightly. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentle, trying not to scare her. "Where's your home? Are you lost?" The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a fear that went beyond the cold. She shook her head, her lips quivering as she struggled to speak. Her words came out in fragments, barely audible over the wind. "Sister, Haley, danger, Dad, bad." Orson's heart sank. He couldn't piece together the full story, but it was clear that she was in trouble, that this wasn't a simple case of a lost child. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he needed to get help. Reaching for his phone, he dialed 911, his fingers numb with cold and urgency. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the line, and Orson explained the situation as best he could, relaying the little information he had gathered. "There's a young girl on the highway. She's in shock, possibly hypothermic. I don't know what's happened, but she mentioned something about her sister in danger." The dispatcher assured him that help was on the way and instructed him to keep the girl as warm as possible until emergency services arrived. Orson wrapped his arms around her, sharing his body heat as he whispered words of comfort, trying to reassure her even as his own heart pounded with worry. In the distance, he saw the flash of red and blue lights approaching, and he felt a surge of relief. But as he held the girl close, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that whatever had brought her to the side of this desolate road was something far darker and more complicated than he could have imagined. The story unfolds. The ambulance and police cruiser skidded to a stop on the icy roadside, lights flashing in the snow-dimmed twilight. Orson watched as paramedics hurried over, their bright jackets and urgent movements adding a sense of surrealism to the scene. The girl was barely coherent, her small body racked with violent shivers, even as she clutched Orson's oversized jacket around herself. One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes and a calm, steady voice, knelt beside the girl. "Sweetheart, we're here to help you. Can you tell us your name?" she asked gently, wrapping a blanket around the child's thin shoulders. The girl blinked, her eyes hazy with exhaustion and cold. Her lips parted, but only a soft, trembling whisper came out. "Sasha." "Okay, Sasha, we're going to get you warmed up and safe," the paramedic said. She glanced over at Orson, who was standing nearby, still shivering in the cold without his jacket. "Are you the one who found her?" Orson nodded, stuffing his hands into his pockets for warmth. "Yeah, I saw her standing by the side of the road. I almost didn't stop." The words tasted bitter as they left his mouth, a heavy confession that carried a weight of guilt. "But I couldn't just leave her there." The paramedic nodded, a look of understanding and approval flickering across her face. "You did the right thing, sir. She might not have survived much longer out here in this weather." She gestured for Orson to follow as she and her partner lifted Sasha onto a stretcher and carried her toward the ambulance. Before they could reach the vehicle, though, Sasha suddenly stiffened, a look of pure terror flashing across her face. Her small hands clung to Orson's arm with surprising strength, her eyes wide and pleading. "Please don't let him find me," she whispered, her voice barely audible but laced with an unmistakable dread. "He's going to hurt Haley." Orson's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing to process her words. "Who, Sasha? Who's going to hurt Haley?" he asked gently, hoping not to frighten her further. Her gaze darted around, as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "My dad. He took her. He's going to hurt her like he hurt my mom." The words hung in the cold air, each one piercing Orson like a shard of ice. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather as he tried to comprehend the horror this young girl had likely endured. The paramedic, now aware of the gravity of the situation, exchanged a quick look with the police officer who had just stepped out of his cruiser. "Sir, Could you step over here for a moment? The officer, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, gestured to Orson. His tone was polite but authoritative, making it clear this wasn't a request. Orson nodded, giving Sasha a reassuring squeeze on her hand before letting go and stepping away with the officer. As they moved to a quieter area, the officer pulled out a small notepad. "Mind if I ask you a few questions about how you found her?" the officer asked, pen poised over the notepad. Orson took a deep breath, recounting the events of the past hour, the initial glimpse of Sasha on the roadside, his hesitation, his decision to turn back. He mentioned the snippets of information Sasha had shared, especially her mention of her sister, Haley, and the apparent threat from her father. The officer listened intently, jotting down notes before glancing over at Sasha, who was now in the back of the ambulance with the paramedic. "Sounds like there's more going on here than a simple case of a lost child. Do you know where she came from, or where her family might be?" Orson shook his head. "No, she hasn't said much. Just enough to make it clear she's scared of her father." The officer sighed, his expression grim. "We'll need to get more details, but right now, our priority is making sure she's safe and warm. Once she's stable, we'll try to find out more about her situation and locate her sister. You did a good thing, stopping for her." Orson nodded, though he felt no sense of pride or relief. The image of Sasha shivering on the roadside was seared into his mind, and the haunting words she'd spoken kept echoing in his ears. "He's going to hurt Haley." As the paramedics prepared to transport Sasha to the hospital, Orson couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow tied to her fate now. He felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, as though his decision to stop had placed him in the middle of her story. And even though the logical part of his mind told him he'd done enough, that he could go back to his delivery and leave this in the hands of the authorities, he knew he couldn't just walk away. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked the officer, surprising himself with the question. The officer raised an eyebrow. "You've already done a lot, but if you're willing, it might be helpful if you stayed nearby, at least until we have a better sense of what's going on. Sometimes kids open up more when they're around someone they trust, and she seems to have taken to you." Orson nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and determination. "Yeah, I'll stick around." They watched as the ambulance doors closed, Sasha's frightened face briefly visible in the window before it disappeared. The vehicle pulled away, its siren silent but lights flashing as it headed toward the nearest hospital. Orson climbed back into his truck, following the police cruiser down the snow-covered road toward the hospital. The cold seemed less biting now, replaced by a simmering anger and a fierce resolve. He didn't know the details of Sasha's story yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her down. In the hospital waiting room, Orson sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap as he watched the door leading to the examination rooms. He had called his boss, explaining the situation as best he could. The response had been predictably unkind, his boss ranting about the delayed delivery and the money it was costing him. Orson barely listened, his mind focused on Sasha and her plight. He ended the call with a terse, "Do what you have to," and let his phone fall silent. After what felt like an eternity, a nurse approached him. "Mr. Orson, you're here for the young girl brought in from the roadside." "Yes, Mom." "How is she?" he asked, standing up. "She's stable now, warmed up and resting. But she's asking for you," the nurse replied, a soft smile on her face, though her eyes hinted at the seriousness of the situation. "It seems you've made quite an impression on her." Orson nodded, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through him as he followed the nurse down a series of hallways to Sasha's room. Inside, the little girl was propped up on a bed, swathed in blankets, her face pale but no longer tinged with the dangerous blue of the cold. When she saw Orson, her face lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude, her small hand extending toward him. Orson took it, giving her a gentle squeeze. "Hi there, Sasha. How are you feeling?" She managed a small smile, though her eyes still held a haunted look. "Better. Thank you for helping me." Orson nodded, his heart breaking at the vulnerability in her voice. You don't have to thank me, kiddo. I'm just glad you're safe." For a moment, they sat in silence, Sasha's small hand still holding onto his as though he were an anchor in a storm. Orson knew there were still many questions unanswered, but he didn't want to push her too hard, not after everything she'd been through. After a while, Sasha looked up, her voice barely a whisper. Are you going to help find my sister?" Orson felt a lump rise in his throat. He knew he couldn't make promises, that there were limits to what he could do. But looking into her hopeful, fearful eyes, he couldn't bring himself to say anything other than the truth he felt in his heart. "I'll do everything I can, Sasha. I promise." Orson nodded, his heart breaking at the vulnerability in her voice. "You don't have to thank me, kiddo. I'm just glad you're safe." For a moment, they sat in silence, Sasha's small hand still holding onto his as though he were an anchor in a storm. Orson knew there were still many questions unanswered, but he didn't want to push her too hard, not after everything she'd been through. After a while, Sasha looked up, her voice barely a whisper. Are you going to help find my sister?" Orson felt a lump rise in his throat. He knew he couldn't make promises, that there were limits to what he could do. But looking into her hopeful, fearful eyes, he couldn't bring himself to say anything other than the truth he felt in his heart. "I'll do everything I can, Sasha. I promise." A fragile bond and dark revelations. Orson sat beside Sasha's hospital bed, his fingers interlocked with hers, offering her the warmth and reassurance he hoped she could feel. The sterile whiteness of the room made him uncomfortable, the constant beeping of monitors serving as a reminder that he wasn't in his familiar world of highways and late-night truck stops. He was in unknown territory, bound by a fragile bond with a girl he had barely met, but felt a responsibility for. A few minutes later, a doctor walked in, his white coat flapping slightly as he approached the bed. He looked down at Sasha with a gentle smile, then glanced at Orson, a question in his eyes. "She seems quite attached to you," the doctor observed, lowering his voice. "Are you family?" Orson shook his head. "No, I found her on the highway. I couldn't just leave her there." He didn't feel the need to go into the details, sensing that the doctor already understood the gravity of the situation. "She's been through something terrible, hasn't she?" The doctor nodded, his expression somber. "It appears so. She's dehydrated, malnourished, and shows signs of prolonged exposure to the cold. But physically, she'll recover. Emotionally, it's a different story." He paused, lowering his voice even more. "She's mentioned her sister, Haley, and hinted at some troubling things about her father." Orson's heart sank. The fragments Sasha had whispered to him were starting to piece together into a chilling picture. He looked down at her, noticing the way she hugged herself under the blanket, as if trying to shield herself from a past she couldn't escape. "Is there anything I can do?" Orson asked quietly, almost to himself, feeling helpless in the face of her pain. The doctor gave him a sympathetic nod. "For now, being here is enough. She trusts you. Maybe you can gently encourage her to share more about her situation, but don't push her. We've alerted social services and the police, but the more we know, the better we can help her." Orson nodded, feeling the weight of this newfound responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. The doctor left the room, leaving him alone with Sasha once more. He took a deep breath, his voice soft and steady. "Sasha, can you tell me a little more about Haley, your sister? Where is she now?" Sasha looked down, clutching the edge of the blanket so tightly her knuckles turned white. A tear slipped down her cheek, and Orson's heart clenched. She's with him," she whispered, barely able to say the words. Her voice broke, and she looked away, ashamed. He took her. He said he was going to make her learn. Like he made me learn." Orson felt his blood turn cold. "Sasha, what do you mean? What did he make you learn?" Her shoulders shook, and she seemed to shrink under the blanket, trying to make herself as small as possible. "He said we had to be strong. That if we didn't listen, we'd be punished. He'd lock us in the basement, for hours, sometimes longer. He'd..." He'd turn off the lights and leave us in the dark. Orson felt a surge of anger so strong it nearly took his breath away. The thought of a child, of any child, locked in darkness as punishment was horrifying. He clenched his fists, struggling to keep his emotions in check for Sasha's sake. Did you try to tell anyone? Your mom, maybe. Sasha's face twisted with a mix of pain and resentment. Mom tried to protect us, once, but she's gone. She couldn't stop him. And now she's gone. It's just Haley and me, and I couldn't protect her either. Orson reached out, gently brushing a tear from her cheek. It's not your fault, Sasha. None of this is your fault. Sasha nodded, though her face still held the haunted look of a child who had seen too much. She leaned forward, speaking in a strained whisper. I ran away. I thought if I left, he wouldn't hurt Haley. But I was wrong. I know he's mad now. I know he'll take it out on her. Her words hit Orson like a punch to the gut. He could sense the desperation in her voice, the helplessness. She had sacrificed her own safety in a futile attempt to protect her sister, only to be haunted by the fear that her actions had made things worse. A knock on the door broke the tension, and a police officer stepped in, the same one who had spoken with Orson by the roadside. He nodded at Sasha, then turned his attention to Orson. Mr. Reed, he said, addressing Orson by the last name he had provided earlier, can we have a word outside? Orson squeezed Sasha's hand gently. I'll be right back, okay? I'm not going anywhere. She nodded, watching him with a fearful gaze as he followed the officer out into the hallway. Once they were alone, the officer's face grew serious. We've managed to gather a little information. Sasha's father is a man named Angel Briggs. He has a record, though nothing on this scale, mostly minor offenses, but it paints a picture. Minor offenses. Orson's voice was incredulous. This man is terrorizing his own children, and we're calling it minor offenses. The officer raised a hand, attempting to calm him. I understand, Mr. Reed. Believe me, we're taking this very seriously. But until we have enough evidence, we have to proceed cautiously. Sasha's claims are disturbing, but we need more than that to take action. Orson felt a wave of frustration rising within him. So what do you plan to do? Are you going to leave her sister with that monster? The officer sighed. Social services is getting involved. We're working on getting a welfare check on the home, but these things take time. For now, our priority is to keep Sasha safe and try to confirm her account. Orson's fists clenched, but he forced himself to breathe, to think rationally. If there's anything I can do to help, I'll do it. The officer looked at him with a measure of respect. Just keep being there for her. She needs someone she can trust. Sometimes that's more valuable than any investigation. Orson nodded, understanding the unsaid weight of the words. As the officer walked away, Orson re-entered Sasha's room, finding her staring out the window with a lost look in her eyes. She turned when she heard him come in, managing a small, hesitant smile. I'm back, he said, sitting beside her once again. And I'm not going anywhere. Sasha looked down, fiddling with the edge of the blanket. Thank you, she murmured, her voice almost inaudible. Nobody ever stayed before. Orson's heart ached for her. He could see now how deep her scars ran, even though she bore no visible wounds. He leaned in, speaking gently but firmly. Sasha, you don't have to face this alone anymore. I promise you that. She nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. The silence stretched between them, each lost in their own thoughts, until she finally spoke again, her voice shaky. What if he doesn't stop? What if he hurts Haley, or comes after me? Orson reached over, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He won't get to you, and we'll make sure he can't hurt Haley either. The police are looking into it. They'll do their best to protect her. Sasha's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of hope and fear. She leaned forward, her small hands gripping his arm as though he were a lifeline. Do you think we'll ever be safe again? Orson looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, He felt a sense of purpose that went beyond the lonely hours on the road or the endless deliveries he made. He felt a fierce determination, a need to fight for this girl and her sister in whatever way he could. "I believe you will, Sasha. I believe that things can get better," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "And I'm going to help you find that safe place." For the first time, Sasha's lips curved into a small, hopeful smile. The journey ahead was uncertain, and he knew they would face many challenges, but as he sat beside her, he realized that he wouldn't let go. He had made a promise, and for Sasha's sake, he intended to keep it. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the small hospital room, there was a newfound warmth, a fragile hope that, for the first time in Sasha's life, maybe she wasn't as alone as she had always believed. Unraveling the secrets, Orson had barely slept. The hospital chair was hard, the fluorescent lights above him dimmed but still buzzing persistently. But it wasn't the discomfort that kept him awake. It was Sasha's haunted expression, the fear in her voice, and the weight of his promise. The few hours he managed to close his eyes, he was plagued by nightmares, images of Sasha and Haley locked in darkness, their faces twisted in silent pleas for help. Morning light finally filtered through the small hospital window, weak and cold. Sasha was still asleep, curled into a small ball under the covers, her breathing shallow but steady. She looked so young, so vulnerable, a stark contrast to the horror she had endured. Orson's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He turned to see Detective Clara Morris entering, her demeanor calm but eyes sharp and observant. She was in her early 40s, with a no-nonsense air that hinted at years of experience handling the most challenging cases. "Mr. Reed," she greeted, offering him a respectful nod. "Could we talk for a moment?" Orson nodded, glancing at Sasha to make sure she was still asleep before stepping out into the hallway with the detective. Detective Morris didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been briefed on Sasha's situation, and I wanted to let you know that we're making it a priority to investigate her father, Daniel Briggs. We're coordinating with social services and setting up a welfare check on the home, as well as reaching out to neighbors for any information they might have." Orson nodded, though the tightness in his chest remained. "That's good. But what about Haley? Sasha's sister. She's still with him." Detective Morris' expression softened. "We're working as fast as we can, Mr. Reed. Unfortunately, these cases are complicated. Without concrete evidence, our hands are somewhat tied." Orson felt a surge of frustration. "Concrete evidence," he echoed, his voice barely concealing his anger. "That man has been terrorizing his daughters. Sasha's terrified. Isn't that enough?" Morris sighed, looking genuinely sympathetic. "Believe me, I wish it were that simple, but we need something that holds up in court. We need to build a case, gather witness statements, and find evidence that corroborates what Sasha has told us. Until then, we're monitoring the situation closely." Orson ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of helplessness bearing down on him. "So, what can I do?" Detective Morris gave him a thoughtful look. "Just be there for her, like you've been. Sasha needs someone she trusts right now. And if she's willing, it would help if you could talk to her. See if she can give us more details, more specific incidents or locations in the house where her father kept her or Haley. Anything she remembers could help us build a stronger case." Orson nodded, feeling the responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. He would do whatever it took. He couldn't bear the thought of leaving Sasha and Haley to fend for themselves against a man like Daniel Briggs. After Detective Morris left, Orson returned to Sasha's room. She was awake now, sitting up in bed, her eyes still swollen with exhaustion. She looked at him, her expression wary, but when he offered her a gentle smile, she relaxed a little, her gaze softening. "Good morning, kiddo," he greeted, sitting beside her. "How are you feeling?" Sasha shrugged, picking at the edge of the blanket. "Better, I guess. But scared." She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm always scared." Orson felt a pang of sorrow for her. No child should have to live like this, constantly haunted by fear. He reached over, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to be scared anymore. We're here to help you. Detective Morris and the police are looking into everything. They're going to make sure you and Haley are safe." Sasha looked up at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "You really think they can stop him?" Orson's heart twisted at the vulnerability in her voice. He wanted to tell her with absolute certainty that everything would be okay, but he knew better than to make promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he said, "We're going to do everything we can. And I'm not going to leave you, I promise." She nodded, wiping a tear away with the back of her hand. "He used to tell us that nobody would believe us, that we were just kids, and no one cared what happened to us." Her voice trembled, and Orson felt his hands clench into fists at the cruelty of her father's words. "People do care, Sasha," he said softly. "I care. And Detective Morris, and the doctors here, they all care too. You're not alone." Sasha sniffled, her gaze dropping to the blanket again. Can I tell you something?" Orson leaned forward, giving her his full attention. "Of course, you can tell me anything." She hesitated, as if gathering the courage to speak, before finally whispering, "There's a room in our basement. He calls it the lesson room. That's where he takes us when he wants to make us stronger. There's a little window at the top, but it's mostly dark. He makes us stay there for hours, sometimes days." Her voice cracked, and Orson felt a chill run down his spine. "I remember one time, he left Haley in there all night," she continued, her voice growing hoarse. "She was only 8. She cried so much that he had to gag her so the neighbors wouldn't hear. He told me that if I didn't behave, I'd end up like her." Orson fought to keep his expression neutral, but inside, rage simmered. How could anyone do this to their own children? He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm for Sasha's sake. "Thank you for telling me, Sasha. That's really brave of you. This will help Detective Morris understand what's happening. She'll know what to look for." Sasha nodded, but her expression remained haunted. I don't want him to hurt Haley because of me. He's going to be so mad when he finds out I'm gone." Orson placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We're not going to let him hurt Haley, Sasha. The police are going to check on her. They'll make sure she's safe." Sasha sniffed, wiping her eyes. "I just want us to be a family again. I want us to be normal, like other kids. I want Haley to laugh again." Orson's heart broke at her words. "I know, Sasha, and we're going to do everything we can to make that happen." Just then, a nurse entered the room, carrying a tray with breakfast. She gave Sasha a warm smile, setting the tray on the table beside her bed. "Good morning, Sasha. We've got some scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice for you." Sasha nodded, barely looking at the food. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant. The nurse glanced at Orson, sensing the tension in the room. "She'll need all the strength she can get, Mr. Reed," she said gently. "We're here to help her recover, but support from people she trusts is the best medicine." Orson nodded, grateful for the nurse's kindness. After she left, he turned back to Sasha. "You should eat something, Sasha. You need your strength." She looked at the food, then back at him. "Will you stay with me?" Orson felt a lump in his throat. "Of course. I'm not going anywhere." As Sasha ate in small, hesitant bites, Orson's mind raced. He knew he had to do more than just sit beside her. He needed to help her find a way out of this nightmare, not just temporarily, but permanently. He couldn't bear the thought of her or Haley going back to that house, back to a life ruled by fear and cruelty. After she finished eating, he gently encouraged her to tell him more about her sister, about the lesson room, about anything that might help the police understand the horrors they had faced. Though her words were halting and sometimes fragmented, she slowly began to reveal the grim reality of her life. As she spoke, Orson realized that he was no longer just a truck driver passing through. He had become a part of Sasha's story, a lifeline for a girl who had been drowning in silence for far too long. And as the day stretched on, He vowed to himself that he would not abandon her. He would fight for her, and for Haley, no matter the cost. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges he couldn't yet foresee. But Orson knew one thing for sure. He would not let these girls face this battle alone. The storm outside might rage on, but within the hospital walls, a small spark of hope had been kindled, and Orson was determined to keep it alive. A plan takes shape. Orson barely recognized himself in the mirror of the hospital's small restroom. The exhaustion etched into his face was new, as was the fierce sense of purpose burning behind his eyes. He had spent the last 2 days practically living in Sasha's hospital room, waiting for updates from the police, monitoring Sasha's condition, and listening as she gradually revealed more about the horrific life she and her sister Haley had endured. Detective Morris had kept her promise. She'd visited twice, updating him on the slow progress of the investigation. But bureaucracy, it seemed, was like quicksand, threatening to bury Sasha's desperate pleas in piles of paperwork and procedure. While the police were working to gather evidence, Orson could see how painfully slow the process was, and he worried every moment for Haley, who was still trapped in that house with her father. It was early evening now, and Sasha was sleeping. Orson sat beside her bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, and felt his resolve harden. He knew he couldn't simply wait around, hoping for the system to rescue Haley. He'd spent too many hours listening to Sasha's stories, hearing about the terrible things her father had done to her and her sister. And he'd come to realize something terrifying. If he didn't act, there was every chance Haley would suffer more, maybe even worse, before help arrived. After what felt like an eternity, Detective Morris walked into the room, her expression grim. She motioned for Orson to join her in the hallway. Reluctantly, he left Sasha's side, closing the door softly behind him. Detective Morris sighed, rubbing her temples. "Mr. Reed, I'm sorry, but the welfare check we arranged, it didn't go as planned. Dangle Briggs didn't let them in. He had a lawyer there, claiming it was a violation of his rights and that there was no probable cause for a search." Orson's fists clenched. But Sasha's story, the abuse, the room in the basement, shouldn't that be enough? The detective's face was sympathetic but tired. "I wish it were that simple, but without physical evidence or a witness willing to speak against him, we're in a bind. The Child Welfare Department is petitioning for an emergency order to search the property, but it could take days, maybe longer if the lawyer fights it." Orson felt his heart sink. "So you're telling me Haley is still in that house with him? And there's nothing you can do right now?" Detective Morris's eyes softened. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Reed. But I understand if that's not enough for you." Orson took a shaky breath, his mind racing. He wasn't sure when he'd made the decision, but suddenly it was there, clear as day. He would go to that house himself. He couldn't sit here another moment, knowing Haley was in danger. He'd been a passive man most of his life, letting others dictate the terms. But something about this situation, about Sasha's haunted face, and the burden she'd placed in his hands, made it impossible for him to stand by any longer. "Detective Morris," he said, voice calm but determined, "if you can't get in there, I will." Morris's expression hardened. "Mr. Reed, don't do anything reckless. We're close, I promise. If you interfere, it could ruin everything. You could be charged with trespassing, or worse." Orson shook his head. "With all due respect, Detective, I don't have time to wait. Haley doesn't have time. That man is dangerous. If you can't stop me, then I'm going to go there tonight." Detective Morris looked at him, a mixture of frustration and admiration in her eyes. "Orson, you're talking about breaking and entering. If Briggs has a gun or calls the police, you could end up hurt or in jail." He met her gaze steadily. "Maybe so, but if it was your kid or your sibling, would you just sit back and hope the system worked in time?" The detective's face softened. She didn't respond, and he took that as tacit permission. She wouldn't officially condone his actions, but she wouldn't stand in his way either. Orson returned to Sasha's room, his heart heavy but resolute. Sasha was awake now, her eyes wide and worried. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice small. He gave her a reassuring smile. "Just talking with Detective Morris." "Listen, Sasha, I need you to trust me, okay? I'm going to make sure Haley is safe." Sasha's face twisted with fear. Are you going to go see him?" Orson hesitated. He didn't want to scare her, but he couldn't lie either. "I have to, Sasha, but I promise I'll be careful. And I'll bring Haley back." She reached out, grabbing his hand with surprising strength. "Please, be careful. He's not like other people. He can be so scary when he's mad." Orson squeezed her hand gently. "I'll be fine, Sasha. I've dealt with plenty of tough situations on the road. I'll come back with Haley, okay?" She nodded, though her eyes were still filled with worry. "Okay." After making sure she was settled and calling in a favor from a nurse to keep a close watch on her, Orson left the hospital. He felt the chill of the winter night seep into his bones as he made his way to his truck. His mind was filled with images of Sasha's stories. The lesson room in the basement, Daniel Briggs' cruel eyes, the horror Haley might be experiencing at this very moment. As he drove, Orson formulated a rough plan. He didn't know what he'd find at the house, but he couldn't let that stop him. He was driven by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. He wasn't a soldier, wasn't a cop, but he was a man with a conscience. And right now, that was enough. He pulled up to the house just past midnight. It was a modest, two-story home, with darkened windows that loomed ominously in the moonlight. The neighborhood was silent, the houses spaced far enough apart that no one would likely hear any commotion. Orson's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to do. Slipping out of the truck, he crept toward the house, sticking to the shadows. He wasn't entirely sure how he would get in, but he'd figure it out. As he approached the back door, he noticed a small window that had been left slightly ajar, likely for ventilation. He carefully pried it open, sliding inside with as little noise as possible. Inside, the house was dark and silent, filled with the stale smell of neglect and something faintly metallic. Orson's heart pounded as he moved down a narrow hallway, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He could feel the oppressive atmosphere of the place, the lingering aura of fear and control. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo through the silence, but he pressed on, moving toward the basement door. He found it at the end of the hall, a heavy wooden door that looked out of place in the otherwise simple home. His heart pounded as he gripped the doorknob, twisting it slowly. It opened with a quiet groan, revealing a steep staircase leading down into darkness. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and descended. At the bottom, he found himself in a cramped, dimly lit room. His eyes adjusted slowly, revealing a chilling scene. Chains attached to the wall, an old mattress on the floor, and faint markings on the walls. It was exactly as Sasha had described. This was the lesson room. And then he heard it, a soft whimper coming from a shadowed corner of the room. Orson moved closer, his heart breaking as he saw Haley, her small frame curled up on the mattress, her face streaked with tears. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror, but recognition dawned when she saw him. "It's okay, Haley," he whispered, kneeling beside her. "I'm here to get you out." She looked at him, her expression a mix of fear and hope. Are you really here to help us?" Orson nodded, gently helping her to her feet. "Yes, Sasha's waiting for you. She's safe. We're going to get you out of here, and you're never coming back." He guided her up the stairs, his senses on high alert for any sign of her father. The house remained silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for them to leave. Orson moved as quickly and quietly as possible, holding Haley's hand tightly. He led her out through the same window he had entered, lifting her carefully and then slipping through himself. Once they were safely outside, he bundled her into the truck, turning on the heat and covering her with a spare blanket. Haley's eyes shone with gratitude and relief as she looked up at him, her small hands clutching the blanket like a lifeline. Orson pulled out of the driveway, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. They weren't safe yet. He knew Daniel Briggs would come after them, would try to take his daughters back. But as he drove toward the hospital, his resolve only grew stronger. He'd brought Haley this far, and he'd see this through to the end. The reckoning. The lights of the hospital glowed in the distance, a beacon in the cold, dark night. Orson gripped the steering wheel tightly, glancing over at Haley, who had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. Her small body cocooned in the blanket. Her face was peaceful, an innocence lingering there despite the horrors she'd endured. He knew that peace was fragile, something he needed to protect at all costs. He pulled into the hospital parking lot, heart pounding with both relief and tension. They were close to safety, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel Briggs wasn't far behind. As he gently lifted Haley out of the truck, her eyes fluttered open, and she clung to him, her small fingers curling around his jacket. Orson gave her a reassuring smile. "Almost there, Haley. Your sister's waiting." Inside the hospital, Detective Morris was waiting for them in the lobby. She'd been alerted by Orson's call during the drive over, and her eyes widened with relief when she saw them. She immediately knelt down to Haley's level, speaking softly. "Hi, Haley. I'm Detective Morris. I'm here to make sure you and your sister stay safe. Is that okay?" Haley looked at Orson, and he nodded gently. She then looked back at Detective Morris, nodding her small head, trust beginning to glimmer in her eyes. Morris gave her a kind smile before standing and addressing Orson. "We've placed Sasha under temporary protective custody. She's safe, and now Haley will be too." Morris paused, her expression serious. "But I have to tell you, Daniel Briggs was already on his way here when I got the call. He knows you have Haley." Orson felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. "What does that mean, Detective?" "It means we're taking extra precautions. We have officers stationed at all the entrances and in Sasha's room. But I want you to be prepared. Men like Daniel don't just back down." Orson clenched his fists, feeling the weight of her words. He looked over at Haley, her eyes filled with exhaustion and hope, and knew he had to be ready for anything. They'd come too far to let that man take these girls back. "Haley!" she cried, her voice choked with emotion. Haley rushed into her sister's arms, and the two girls held each other tightly, whispering words of comfort. Orson watched, feeling the deep warmth fill his chest. He'd done it. He'd brought them back together, and for a moment, everything felt right. But that peace was shattered by the sound of raised voices down the hall. Orson's body tensed, and he turned to see Detective Morris already reaching for her radio, issuing quiet commands for backup. She looked at Orson, her expression grim. "It's him." Orson's heart pounded. He knew that Daniel Briggs wouldn't leave without a fight, and now the only thing standing between that man and these two girls was him, and Detective Morris. The detective pulled out her gun, motioning for Orson to stay with the girls. "I'll handle this," she said firmly. "But if anything happens, you take them and run. Don't look back." Orson nodded, his eyes blazing with determination. He watched as Morris slipped out of the room, leaving him alone with the girls. Sasha and Haley clung to each other, their faces pale but resolute. Orson knelt beside them, speaking in a low, calming voice. "Listen to me, girls. No matter what happens, you're not going back to him. I promise." They both nodded, their trust in him unwavering. Orson felt a surge of responsibility, an overwhelming desire to protect them, to shield them from the darkness that had haunted their lives for too long. The noise outside grew louder. Orson heard the harsh sound of Daniel's voice, demanding to see his daughters, insisting they were his property. His words dripped with venom and entitlement, each syllable a twisted reminder of the power he believed he held. Then, a loud crash echoed through the hall, followed by a scuffle. Orson's heart raced. He strained to hear, feeling the weight of the silence that followed. Moments later, Detective Morris appeared at the doorway, her face tense but controlled. "Orson, he's pushing through the officers. They're trying to hold him." But her voice trailed off, and she didn't need to say more. Orson turned back to Sasha and Haley, his voice low but resolute. "Stay behind me, okay? No matter what, don't let go of each other." The girls nodded, clinging to each other as Orson positioned himself between them and the door. The sounds in the hallway grew closer, footsteps heavy and purposeful. Then the door burst open, and Daniel Briggs stormed in, his face twisted with rage. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and intimidating, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. His eyes landed on Sasha and Haley, and he sneered, his lips curling into an ugly smile. "There you are," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can just run from me?" Orson stepped forward, his stance firm and unyielding. "They're not going anywhere with you." Daniel's gaze shifted to Orson, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you?" "Just some truck driver who thinks he's a hero." Orson held his ground, his voice steady. "I'm someone who cares more about these girls than you ever have, and I won't let you hurt them anymore." Daniel let out a mocking laugh, glancing over his shoulder as if looking for an audience. "You? Stop me? You're nothing." Orson felt a surge of anger, but kept his voice controlled. "Maybe I am nothing to you, but I'm something to them, and that's enough." Detective Morris stepped forward, her gun raised, her voice firm. "Mr. Briggs, you are under arrest for child endangerment and abuse. I suggest you cooperate." But Daniel sneered, his gaze filled with contempt. "You think you can arrest me? I have rights. Those are my daughters." Morris didn't waver. "You have the right to remain silent, and I suggest you use it." But Daniel lunged forward, his eyes blazing with fury, aiming straight for Orson and the girls. Without thinking, Orson threw himself in front of them, bracing for impact. The two men collided, and Orson felt the full weight of Daniel's anger as they grappled, fists flying, each blow landing with bruising force. Orson wasn't a fighter, but he was driven by something far stronger than Daniel's hatred. He was driven by love and a fierce need to protect. Every punch he threw, every blow he absorbed, was for Sasha and Haley. He could hear the girls crying behind him, their voices mixing with the shouts of the officers and the chaos of the struggle. Finally, Detective Morris and the other officers managed to pull Daniel off him, wrestling him to the ground. Orson staggered back, his vision blurred but his spirit unbroken. He watched as Daniel was handcuffed, his face twisted in rage and defeat. As they led him out of the room, he glared at Orson, spitting out words laced with venom. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." Orson met his gaze, unflinching. "No, Daniel. You're the one who will regret it." With Daniel Briggs finally removed from their lives, the room fell silent. Orson turned to find Sasha and Haley clinging to each other, their faces pale but filled with relief. He knelt beside them, pulling them into a gentle hug, feeling the weight of the moment settle over them all. "It's over," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore." Sasha looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, hope. "Thank you, Orson. Thank you for saving us." He smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You saved yourselves, Sasha. I just helped a little." In the days that followed, arrangements were made for the girls to go into the care of a loving foster family, with plans for them to eventually be placed together permanently. Detective Morris promised to keep a close eye on their case, ensuring they were treated with the kindness and respect they deserved. Orson visited them often, bringing small gifts and sharing stories from his life on the road. He became a fixture in their lives, a symbol of safety and love, a father figure they had never had but desperately needed. One day, as he prepared to leave, Haley tugged on his sleeve, her eyes wide and hopeful. "Will you keep visiting us, Orson?" He knelt down, looking into her eyes with a gentle smile. "Of course, Haley. You're stuck with me now." As he walked away that day, Orson felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose, of belonging. He had spent so many years drifting, living for himself, but now he knew his life had changed in ways he'd never anticipated. He had become more than just a truck driver. He had become a hero, a protector, and most importantly, family to two little girls who had taught him what it truly meant to love and be loved. And in the end, that was worth more than any miles he'd ever driven, more than any cargo he'd ever carried. It was everything.